Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with fabulous concert programs number 11. And we're continuing our Martinu Symphony Cycle, and we are all the way up to Symphony number 5. Now, the Fifth Symphony is a three-movement symphony, and it starts to get into Martinu's late period, some of the more fantastical and spacey kind of music. It's really, really a beautiful work, but also somewhat strange and a little bit hard to program. And I've come up with one that I think will work extremely well. I've actually only seen the Fifth Symphony in concert once. Charles Dutoit did it with the Montreal Symphony, a very, very good concert. It had some other stuff. It had, Ionescu's First Romanian Rhapsody, and I think Bolero, and there was some other things in it. I don't know. It was a very good concert, actually. And there was actually a rumor at the time in the classical music world that Charles Dutoit was going to make an entire Martinu cycle for Decca. And we tried to find out if he was doing it, and it turned out he was doing something or someone, but it wasn't Martinu. So unfortunately, that never came to pass. It was at the end of his association with Decca. But, at least I got to hear it once. And Martinu's sense of form, I just want to talk about this for a minute because it's really very, very interesting. Martinu had a very interesting concept of symphonic form, a very simple one and a very effective one. And he doesn't get any credit for that, of course, because he doesn't really get much credit for anything. But people really ought to listen carefully to how he structures a movement. His concept of sonata form, and he had one, by the way, was what we might call sonata without development. It was essentially Mozart's slow movement form. And what happens in that kind of a movement is that you have a first subject group of themes, and then a second subject group of themes, and this comes to a complete close, and then it starts over again with the first subject and the second subject. And both of those are elaborated in some way, usually to bring the movement to a natural climax. So it's not as if everything is repeated literally. It isn't. It's reimagined as it's repeated the second time. And what Martinu did was he inserted a kind of development section in between the repeat of the first subject and the second subject. And this you can hear very, very clearly, for example, in the first movement of the Fourth Symphony, and you hear it in the outer movements of the Fifth as well. And that is it's actually all the more clear in the outer movements of the Fifth because there is no real slow movement in this symphony. So the slow music occurs in the context of the outer section, the first subject of each of the outer movements of the Fifth Symphony. That is, they go slow and then fast, and then they progress to something else, and then they come to a full stop, and then you go back to the slow introduction, and you hear it again. And this happens in both movements. And that makes them reflections of each other. It's an extremely tightly integrated work. And in the middle of the Fifth Symphony, there is a combination sort of slow movement scherzo. It's a moderately paced movement of great, it's almost neoclassical elegance. It's full of pattern making, really interesting patterns. It starts with this yum ba-dum 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 bum 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 like that. And over that you hear these really hauntingly beautiful melodies. There's a gorgeous flute solo, there's a thing for a couple of trumpets, and it results in a cadence that goes do 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 do. I mean, it's really nifty. Really, really interesting. So, it's a fascinating work. The other thing that's interesting about the Fifth is that Martinu's symphonic progress, and he wrote his first 5 symphonies all within a few years of each other, and then the sixth came a decade later. But they were all written in the 1940s, and he began using harp and piano as a kind of orchestral continuo to accompany just about everything because he felt nervous about his orchestration, which is just ridiculous because he created this marvelous sound using this ensemble. But the harp drops out after number 3. There wasn't one in number 4. There isn't one in number 5. And the piano drops out after number 5. And by number 6, he's using just the orchestra with no extras, none of those helpful aids, as he would have called them. But the result is just an extraordinarily personal idiom. So, where do we put the Fifth Symphony? Well, I have decided that we're not going to do the normal overture, concerto, symphony thing. I'm turning that a little bit on its head. We have three works. The first is Falla, Nights in the Gardens of Spain. We're beginning straight off with the concerto-like object. You don't need an overture. See, Nights in the Gardens of Spain is just one of the most gorgeous pieces of music in the universe. It's so beautiful, it's painful. I mean, it's just glorious. Problem with it is it's poetic, and it's a tone poem really, with piano, and all of the movements end quietly. And so it's hard to put. You don't want to end a concert with it. You don't even want to end a first half with it half the time. I mean, I was spoiled for Nights in the Gardens of Spain because here I was in New York, and we had Alicia de la Rocha, who seemed to be the New York Philharmonic's house Falla pianist. I mean, she was always on hand. You could trot her out to do Nights in the Gardens of Spain. And so they stuck it everywhere. And oh my God, they were beautiful performances. So you have to begin with Nights in the Gardens of Spain, a fabulous, poetic, evocative, glorious piece of music for piano and orchestra. But it's also quite difficult, and it's also short. It's like 22 minutes long. So it's fine to start the concert with. Then we do Martinu 5. And it works very well with the Falla because it's also a somewhat nocturnal, kind of spooky, mysterious work. It seems to emerge naturally from the Falla, and the presence of the piano is also a unifying element. It's not solo as it is in the Falla, of course. It's an accompanimental sonority. But it works really, really well if you put the two together. And then you have your intermission. And when you come back, what do? Beethoven's Seventh. First of all, everyone's coming back for Beethoven's Seventh, so that's a good thing. Second of all, the fascinating thing here is that the finale of the Martinu Fifth has the same dactylic rhythm as the first movement of Beethoven's Seventh. In other words, it's going yum-ba-dum-bum-ba-dum-bum-ba-dum-bum-ba-dum. In fact, the very ending of Martinu's Fifth is ya-da-dum-ba-da-dum-ba-da-bum-ba-da-bum-ba-da-bum-ba-da-bum-ba-dum-bum. Exactly like Beethoven's Seventh. So there's a real connection between the two. And I think if you play the Beethoven after the Martinu, it will retroactively give people a wonderful feeling about what they heard in that Martinu symphony, because the final notes of that will be the first movement notes, opening notes, not the opening of the symphony because there's that big long introduction, but it's actually very interesting, the first movement of Beethoven's Seventh, because it has a big long introduction followed by a movement that's going dum-ba-dum-bum-ba-dum-bum-ba-dum-bum-ba-dum. Well, that's exactly what the finale of the Martinu does. It has a slow introduction followed by a main movement that's dum-ba-dum-bum-ba-dum-bum. Well, you'll hear it. Play them next to each other. They make wonderful companions because, of course, Martinu's style is very, very different from Beethoven's in many respects, but rhythmically, that identity is there. And so you'll have an absolutely fantastic program, beginning with the impressionistic, atmospheric element, which is shared between the Falla and the Martinu, and ending with the rhythmic element, which is shared between the Martinu and the Beethoven. I love this program. I really do. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.